Welcome to The World This Week. France 24 inviting 4 editorial minds to come and chew over events of the past 7 days around the world. They are Agnès Poirot, correspondent of L'Express in London.
Not
Great to see you.
Poirot. I'm not cliche.
Poirier, excuse me. I don't believe I said that. Agnès Poirier. Agnès Poirier. Poetry is a Poirier, yes?
Yes.
That's it. Good. Agnès Poetry is correspondent for L'Express in London. Please forgive me. On the other side of the studio, and I shall get my words correct, Richard Verly, who is correspondent for France and Europe for the information website Blick.
That's correct.
Good to see you, sir. On the other side of the studio, Craig Capitas, contributing editor of The Daily Beast. Great to see you, sir. And someone who, well, familiar face here in France 24, usually down the line in Kharkiv in northern Ukraine, but here today especially for us, Catherine Norris-Trent, our senior correspondent. Catherine, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's progress with the latest from Ukraine. Vladimir Putin unilaterally declaring a truce on January the 6th through to January the 7th. That's basically marking the Orthodox Christmas in Ukraine and, of course, in Russia. It's day 317 of the war, triggered, of course, by Russia's president's decision to launch that invasion of Ukraine last February. The word on the ground, though, in Ukraine is that the shelling has continued. The Russian occupiers striking the town of Kramatorsk twice. That's in the north of the Donetsk region. Shelling, too, in the disputed Donbass town of Bakhmut. Russian troops bogged down there, of course, in a very bitter battle for the town. We hear reports that shellings come from both sides there, to be fair and just about telling this story. So the Moscow Times reporting that the truce is a fake. And indeed, from the Ukrainian side, the theme is that there can only be a truce when Russia pulls its forces out from occupied and annexed land. That's not just Lugansk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia and Kherson, but also Crimea. Let's listen to Ukraine's President, Vladimir Zelensky, speaking a little earlier.
Now they want to use Christmas as a cover to at least briefly stop the advance of our guys in Donbass and to bring equipment, ammunition and mobilized men closer to our positions. What will this bring? Just another rise in the death toll.
Vladimir Zelensky. Let's bring in Catherine Norris-Trent, who has reported extensively for us in Ukraine. Catherine, when you heard Vladimir Putin declaring this unilateral truce, what was your kind of reaction to that?
My reaction was that people in Ukraine had been saying to me for months that Russia wanted to freeze fighting where it is, to restock, to rearm, to regroup, and that Ukrainians would be viewing this very cynically and very skeptically as a move basically to do that, to try and regroup, to try and move their troops around, to try and get a breather in places like Bakhmut, where the fighting has been incredibly intense. And also, you know, that to try and use it as a stick to beat the Ukrainians, because Ukraine has never accepted this ceasefire. They don't believe it's genuine. So therefore, lots of people in Ukraine believe that Russia's just going to use this as saying, look, Ukraine won't accept the ceasefire. So, you know, it's all about the communications and the way it's being presented. But I don't think people are under much illusion in Ukraine that this is going to be a real ceasefire. They don't believe anything that Vladimir Putin has to say.
Craig.
I don't think it's cynical on Putin's part, because he is attached at the hip to the patriarch Kirill. That is important for Putin's ultimate aim of recreating the Russian imperium, the mystical portion of it. So it makes sense he's doing that to appease Putin, or to appease Kirill, not anyone in Ukraine. But frankly, there's 2 points here. You know, I don't know if you remember the movie Batman, when Alfred, Batman's trusty butler, looks at Batman and says, "Some men just want to watch the world burn." And this is really where we're getting with Putin right now. And the other side of that coin is actually rather ugly, because the only way you're going to stop Putin's devastation right now is through the banks. And the governments of the world, from the Swiss to the Americans to everyone else, are doing nothing. They've done nothing to seize the some $1 trillion of assets that are either have been frozen, or it's not the legal term, but that the Russian government and the oligarchs can't get their hands on. Those transactions are still being made. The principal owners of those accounts are still getting interest. and the governments, Switzerland chief among them, they don't want to do anything to try and disrupt this cash flow. And I would submit that despite whatever happens on the ground, this thing is not going to end until Putin and his cronies, his criminal cronies, are either overthrown or his financial system is completely obliterated.
Roman Abramovich, former owner of Chelsea Football Club, cleared out a lot of his stash, if you like, billions and billions apparently before the sale of the club in order to avoid the situation that you're talking about. And yes, sorry.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah.
Simply because it got, warned by Boris Johnson, who had made, Evgeny Lebedev a lord a few months earlier. Russian oligarchs in London got how many weeks? Was it 3 or 4 weeks?
It was like
when they knew what
big alert, wasn't it? Flags
well,
waving.
big alert, yes, and
Yeah.
we'll remember this. Although what you're saying, is true, but don't you think? It's not as if the West has been sitting, not doing anything for a year. We might want it to have done more, but don't you think?
I would beg to differ with you. I've been covering this story very closely. Last March 3rd, the European Union hired a group of people who wanted to remain anonymous. We did stories on this in The Beast to kind of track down some of this money and potentially freeze it, find out where it was. I spoke with these principals about 3 weeks ago. They haven't gotten anywhere because they're not getting cooperation from the banks and the governments, from the offshores, whether it's the Caymans, Panama, Bermuda, the Netherlands Antilles. You're right, okay, but in the weirdness that's Russia and the international financial world, you're also wrong, because the people who they've sent out to try and track these funds have principally gotten nowhere. And the Ukrainians, as Catherine well knows, have been screaming for this money to be seized and turned over to them. And you're talking in the neighborhood of $1 trillion of Russian state assets. That's like from the state banks and private assets. And to get them, you basically have to go to a court. No one's trying to figure out a workaround. And one of the many problems, one of the many questions, let's say you did try to seize these assets in a court. Can the Russians actually send in an attorney to defend their assets? Because they don't have any money to pay a lawyer. So would that mean that the court would have to go to the public defender's office to have a public defender defend Russia in court for the seizure of assets? That's just one of a boxcar load of questions here that the governments and prosecutors don't want to get near. You just try going to an offshore to ask about this, you think they would help. We did a calculation, 38,760 people dead. I'm sorry, no, it's not. 34,400 civilian and military Ukrainian deaths since 2014. Talk about blood and treasure. That's 38,760 gallons of blood that's been spilled. So how much warm blood, let's be brutal, like the Russians, how much warm blood do you have to spill before you can unfreeze these assets and shut Russia down? It's a legitimate question, and very few people want to ask it.
Incredibly murky. Richard, the truce, though. It's a front. It's a fiction, isn't it?
Well, there are two subjects on the table now. On the one hand is Putin truce, and on the other hand is the question of Russian assets. As far as Putin truce is concerned, to me it proves one thing beyond his link with Kirill, the patriarch, and so on. It proves that he needs time. He's the one who needs time at the moment in this conflict. And if he needs time, it's because he's in a weaker position. Otherwise, we all know that if he had been on the offensive, if he had been winning this war, he would probably not have declared the truce, though he has very close link with the Orthodox Church in Russia. That's for the truce. For the asset, I must say, I did not talk to the principals. I know that group that the European Union formed with some American experts in. I am very surprised by what you have just said. I am very surprised. There have been 9 packages of sanction approved, and in those packages, every time list of names of oligarchs and people whose assets have been frozen. Now, let's be clear. When you talk about freezing asset, you're not talking about seizing assets. That's a different issue. So indeed, yes, including Switzerland. Switzerland has frozen assets of the oligarch in Swiss bank. It does not mean that those assets are still not producing money. They are actually still producing interest. They are still working as funds in a way to seize assets. Yes, and I think it's legitimate. You need to have a court decision. Even if these funds are Russian, even if this is a war, I mean, you need at some point to go to the judicial system. Otherwise, I mean, you cannot seize assets like this. I'm not saying that it would be a bad idea. It might be a good idea to seize those assets and hand them over to the Ukrainian government, but you just can't do it like this. That's not possible.
That has to be a legal process,
That's
obviously.
not what the international order is based on. And the thing about this conflict is we are, the West, defending the international
And
order.
there are many battlefields. I mean, that's one
right.
of them.
That's the most important.
But again, I mean, that will take time. But on the ground, I mean, what is key this year in 2023 is that the West continue to give weapons. And the US has been, and Joe Biden has been incredibly good at that. We could do more, obviously. And that's the ground.
I think I was going to say, just this week, France announced that it's giving an unnamed quantity of, well, some people would call them light tanks, others call them armoured fighting vehicles, reconnaissance vehicles, these AMX-10s. This is significant because not only is it, in terms of France kind of stepping up its weapons delivery, it's been criticised for not doing enough, but also the issue of tanks and how far do you go before you provoke an escalation. Western capitals have been very fearful of this, especially Germany. Ukraine has been calling for all kinds of things, for planes, for tanks. It got the Patriot air defence system when Zelensky went to Washington. And now this is the first time that there are these kind of sort of tanks. They haven't got tracks, they've got light armour, but they have got a 105mm cannon on top, which can fire at other tanks. They're going to be very useful for Ukraine. We don't know how many are going, but it's interesting because it could open the door to other Western countries sending modern tanks. They've got Soviet-era tanks, but they need more modern equipment, they say, to get through the impasse that the fighting is at right now.
It is significant for 2 reasons. First reason is because this type of vehicle is exactly what the Ukrainian army needs when the end of the winter comes. When it will become very muddy, they are easy. I mean, the mobility of these tanks is much better than the traditional tanks. Secondly, it is a way for France to pressure Germany. Because at the moment, the big problem is Germany refusing
to
give that type of material. So I think Germany will come soon with announcement. I mean, that's my
This
guess.
is the whole thing. Look, you're showing these wonderful photos of armor rolling
Provided by the French army.
rolling across the fields. But let's go to the more important battlefront, which is the financial battlefront. Okay, we hear this word frozen. These assets are not legally frozen. The term is hindered. Hindered assets. Frozen assets is another level. The only assets that are frozen right now is a portion of the oligarchs' assets. You can use the word immobilize these assets, but they're just sitting there and gaining interest. And for every tank that goes out, if the Germans ever get off their high knees and send the Leopard tanks, for every tank that goes out, there's money here that the Russians are making and getting back-channeled in through Turkey and other countries to buy armaments to keep blowing the bloody hell out of the Ukrainians. So we get all wrapped up in this armament. Look at these guns. Look at this guy looking through his scope. The battlefield is in the banks. And this war, unless Putin and his cronies are overthrown, is not going to end until the West takes control of the banking system.
But there's another war. There's the energy war. I mean, when you think, I don't think finances is all. I think it's one part of the jigsaw. I mean, it's a very important part, and you're making the point very eloquently. But look at a country like Germany. In just a year, it's becoming independent in terms of energy.
Incredible
and
transformation, yeah.
Merkel said for 16 years that it was impossible. Okay? So things are happening. Don't worry. And Ukraine will win the war. I mean, it's interesting because you think it's going to last forever. I mean, it's likely, and we're talking about trenches and, a very, very difficult war. On the other hand, we all know that Ukraine will win the war. So we need to do everything we can
well,
to
then
have
the
them.
question is for Catherine, who's the only one here who's actually been in the field. How many more gallons of blood are the Ukrainians willing to use beyond the nearly 40,000 that the Russians have already sucked from them?
Do you know what? That's an incredibly hard question, but the determination of Ukrainian people, military and civilians, is absolutely incredible and has been right since day one of this war, when people were going, it's going to take 3 days, it's all going to be over quickly, what are you going to do? And they were like, no, we're going to fight. And, it's an existential fight, and it's actually galvanized a lot more people. So, and the whole, what we've seen this winter with Russia striking energy facilities and trying to freeze the Ukrainians out and trying to break the morale, that hasn't worked either. That has galvanized people. People are suffering. It's very, very hard. Some people are leaving their homes again. It's really difficult, but it is not succeeding for the moment in breaking the Ukrainians' morale. That's just the fact that they're looking to try and get through this winter. They hope it can be finished this year. Really not sure it can be. And so this is why the Ukrainians are calling for a massive inflow of cash to try and ramp up the battle so much that it will lead to some kind of conclusion.
Catherine, thank you. Let's move on to our second topic today. In politics, nothing is a sure thing. Ask Kevin McCarthy. He was a firm favourite to be voted in as Speaker of the House of Representatives, but a far-right caucus of 20 has stymied that plan, not once, not twice, but 11 times so far. We're currently in day 4 of this selection process, unprecedented in modern times. In the meantime, Congress is unable to work. President Biden calls it all an embarrassment and not a good look for the Republicans.
With regard to the fight over the Speaker, excuse me, that's not my problem. I just think it's a little embarrassing it's taking so long in the way they're dealing with one another. And the rest of the world's looking. They're looking at, can we get our act together?
Craig Capitas, can I give you first bite at this one?
If you elect clowns, don't be surprised when you end up with a circus. Next question.
We get the politicians we deserve. Is that the upsum?
Yeah, in a democracy, you deserve what you get, and you get what you deserve, and you can parse what's going on in Washington until the cows come home. It's the ultimate tar baby problem, It's aggravated by any attempt to solve it, and it's going to continue. And we can sit here and go into the minutia of it, but it's a clown show. This is what you get when you elect these people. And by the way, I know it's on the agenda. We can say the same thing for your country, Great Britain. It's the same thing. It's in a democracy, it's the voters. And if the voters don't pay attention and elect these chuckleheads, what the hell do you expect?
Indeed. Save the British thing. Save the British thing for a moment. Let's get through the American thing. And yes, do you have any thoughts? I'm sure you have many.
Well, that's the thing. If you have anti-government members in the House, well, they don't want to be governed. So that's what they do. What is fascinating is, if you look back at the 20th century and until, quite recently, the Republican Party, whether you like it or not, was the party of government. That was the party that fell in line whenever necessary. It was also party of discipline. And the Democrats were the, ideologues or the dreamers, quite unruly, difficult to govern internally. And then suddenly there's this shift, because, they've been courting the Tea Party faction that should have remained a faction, 10 years ago? I mean, that's preceded Trump, and that, obviously, Trump is a result of that. So, I don't know whether we're going to have, 133 rounds of votes like in 1856, took 2 months?
We can only hope.
And
we'll still be discussing it.
But it's interesting because if it goes on like this, then it sounds pretty good for the Democrats at the next elections, and that will come pretty soon. So there's this shift. Okay, Democrats are now, obeying orders and falling in line when necessary, and the byword for competence. And the Republican Party has become completely dysfunctional. I mean, it's, from across the pond, it's quite interesting to see.
One wonders what this means for the future of the Republican Party.
Well, true. That's what I was going to say. I mean, now we know with what is happening in the U.S. House of Representatives that Biden actually won the midterms, though he lost control of the House of Representatives. But when you see what's happening, when you see how the Republican Party is behaving, when you see the division that they are stuck, you can really believe that Biden has an advantage, and he has now a clear advantage. And the way he talks about it, being kind of very distant, polite, saying, well, it's not my turf, but the world is watching, you should be careful. I mean, frankly speaking, Trump is now in a damaging spiral for his own party. And the difficulty is that those who believe that he would bring them back to power may soon realize that he is bringing them down. So I would agree with Agnès. The Democrats are clearly profiting from that very sad situation, I might say, but probably it was a situation to expect.
Indeed. Catherine, it's one of these things that you couldn't make up, because this is happening on the anniversary of the Capitol riot as well.
I know, it's like it's made for TV,
if we sat down
isn't
and wrote this as a soap opera, people would say, no,
people,
that wouldn't happen.
A couple of decades ago, we wouldn't have been able to believe that this was happening at all. And yeah, the Democrats making hay with this. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, saying that, making the direct comparison, saying, look, this pandemonium is linked to the MAGA radicalism and making it impossible to govern. It's been a long time brewing, this kind of conspiracy theories, denial of authority, denial of government, and it's still the same kind of manifestation.
This is the kind of people we're talking about, the sort of the 20 holdouts, as they're called.
It's
There
more
are
than
some
20.
there are some pretty extreme
it's more
people,
than
aren't they?
20. The election deniers are 3, 4, maybe 5 dozen. Many of them are voting for McCarthy. Wow. So it's not just these 20 Beavis and Butthead guys we have here. there's a whole other crowd. The next 2 years is going to be nightmarish.
And they call themselves the Freedom Caucus.
That's one of their groups.
Kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. Another group of them call themselves the Liverpool Football Supporters Club.
Don't go there, Craig. Don't go there.
Why on earth would they do that, I wonder?
It has something to do with hubcaps.
And yes, bring us back to the topic.
You mean to Liverpool? That's the next topic.
I'm trying to give you a segue to the Brexit.
Oh, I'm loving it. Let's go straight to the UK, because that's clearly where we're going right now. The situation then in the UK. Let's go to the UK, because we were scheduled to go to China, but no, go to the UK. In the grip of strikes across multiple sectors, I'm thinking of train strikes. I was fortunate at Christmas I was able to cross the country with no problems on a train when I went home to see family. But notably, those strikes beginning pre-Christmas are continuing, but many other sectors are downing tools as well over the cost of living crisis. And this all comes more or less 2 years to the day since Brexit was done. And how that's been done, eh? Promises to bring back control have proven to be hollow, to say the least. The NHS in particular, the health service in Britain, overwhelmed by staff shortages. And, of course, the pandemic. Some also point to a sort of privatisation by the backdoor policy of the Conservative government regarding healthcare, which is another issue we could discuss as well. But think about what Brexit meant, all these kind of things. You see Boris Johnson there in front of the big bus saying 350 million per week goes to the EU. We'll take it and give it to the NHS. Did that actually happen? The bulldozer there getting Brexit done with his oven-ready deal. It all looks really burnt now, doesn't it, the whole thing? Think about Britain today. The OECD, just based up the street from us here in Paris, says that all of the G20 countries, only Russia is set to perform worse than the UK this year. An average UK household will be worse off, they say, than an average family in Slovenia. Nothing against Slovenia, but the idea that Slovenia and the UK, I don't know, basically you're going to be worse off if you live in Britain than you would be if you're in Slovenia. And yes.
Where do we start?
What's your experience of London, yes?
So the strikes, I mean, let me give you just an example. Now, when you switch on your television and watch Sky News or the BBC, you have a little, banner telling you what you can expect on the day. And that, you've got weather forecasts, now you've got strikes forecasts.
Strike forecasts,
So and I do screen grab to just remind myself, okay, so tomorrow, if you're a student, okay, will my teacher be there? Will I be able to hop on a train? If I break my leg, what happens? Oh,
you
no,
get an ambulance.
no ambulance and no nurses. And of course, there's a minimum service in the UK. But even Rishi Sunak's government wants to pass a bill an anti-strike bill, basically, and to make that a minimum level of public service be enhanced, and therefore, unions being almost incapable of calling for a strike. And Keir Starmer said that if ever that bill was going to be passed, he would repeal it once elected in only 18 months' time. Because, we have a Tory government that is in power, that is slightly more calm and more rigorous and more, serious than the ones before. That's easy. But really, this is all news. So Keir Starmer is really the guy that, the whole public opinion is watching and listening to. And all the polls show him to be ahead. Labour is ahead by 20 points. So it looks almost assured that they will be elected next year. But Labour is actually not backing the strikes, if we're still talking about the strikes. It's been, in July, it even sacked one of its transport minister in the shadow cabinet for having been in front of Euston station in support, showing solidarity.
He stood with the picket line showing solidarity.
Because he wants, he says, if you're in government, you don't go to the picket line, you try and resolve the issue. And so they are acting as a government in waiting, but to the point of almost blurring the image of the Labour Party. So that's very interesting, because the next year is going to be about Labour and Keir Starmer trying to move the party completely, away from Corbynism, but also towards sort of social democracy, to Blairism, 2.0. And if they manage to do this, they will win.
Sorry, the only problem is that Keir Starmer is not Tony Blair in terms of charisma, in terms of presentation, and 18 months is a long time until the next general election.
He's getting much better there.
He's getting better, but it's it's still a bit creaky, isn't it? I feel that Labour can still mess
What
this
is he, a
up from
bottle
here.
of wine?
And you still have a big elephant in the room, and that is Brexit.
Absolutely.
So how do you address the Brexit issue? How do you address the question of reconciling the UK with the EU? That means bringing a new kind of agreement with the EU. How you dare to do that? And to me, I'm not an expert in UK politics, but Labour at the moment is still paralyzed over Brexit issue. And that is a problem, because the only way to get the British economy back on its feet is to re-anchor the country to the European Union one way or another.
Except
One line. Starmer said that he won't take the UK back into the EU.
No, he can't. He can't say that
I
for
was
the
saying
moment.
re-anchoring the UK to the EU. I was not saying reintegrate.
No, of course, but he can't even talk
They're
about Brexit
terrified.
during the campaign.
They're terrified of
because
going
we're
back.
effectively in campaign.
You should. I think we should. You should be very proud of your homeland. The UK, used to be run by men and women of integrity.
I'm from Liverpool. I'm very proud of Liverpool.
And that mistake has now been rectified. The Conservatives have done a really good job. It reminds me of an old line that was said in the British Parliament, I think early last century. Someone asked, "Why does the sun never set on the British Empire?" And some wag in the back screamed out, "Because no one would trust an Englishman after dark." and that's kind of the situation that we're in here. And it's good for the economy, by the way, because one of Great Britain's greatest exports is comedy. And boy, the comedy is just terrific. I mean, just wonderful.
We've got a lot of material, haven't we?
Oh, Jonathan Pye, there's just great British comedians right now, as you folks say, taking the piss out of out of this government. Richie Sunak.
I'm trying to work out if people be offended by that phrase. I should apologise for Craig's language, but we get it.
Yeah, you get. I mean, that is I've heard that
There's a lot
expression on the BBC, by the way.
Oh, well, it's okay then.
I just wanted to come in and say, you were talking about comparing the UK's wealth to Slovenian wealth. It does really feel like people are getting a lot poorer, and that is really hitting home. Like family and friends in the UK, people I know, their living standards have gone down an awful lot. People, professionals going to food banks. My cousin is a doctor in an A&E department, in an emergency department in the north of England, and the things she tells me about her shift are just unbelievable, and it's getting harder and harder, and there are no staff, so she's constantly called up, can you do another 12-hour shift, can you do another one, because there's no one there.
Is that a Brexit thing, Catherine?
It's linked to Brexit. It's not only Brexit.
It's not only Brexit.
Will they
there are many
rejoin?
factors.
What's your take, Mark?
I mean, Starmer says he won't take
Forget
the country
what
back in. That's
Starmer
what he
says.
says.
What is your gut? What is our gut?
Eventually, but not for a long,
It
long
will
time.
take
It's
one or two
politically,
generations.
it will take a long time. And under what conditions? Because, by the way, in the UK, there is this debate going on, not among the political parties, but among people, journalists, and people talking about rejoining. 65% of the British public would now be in favour of rejoining. They were against Brexit. But the EU doesn't particularly want the UK back, and the conditions would not be the same.
Let me put a question to you, Richard. Which will happen first, Britain getting back into the EU or Prince Harry getting back into the royal family?
Oh, God, I thought we could...
I thought you were going to ask, will the UK get back to the EU before Switzerland will enter the EU? I was not ready to talk about Prince Harry.
You mentioned Prince Harry before, so I brought that in.
regarding Switzerland, I think Switzerland will never be in the EU.
Okay. How about Prince
Probably
Harry?
the UK it will be difficult and it will take time to go back. Now, concerning Prince Harry, well, there is a thing called, I would say, feeling, fatherhood feeling, and I guess King Charles will probably forgive his second son for writing what he has written, I guess.
You guess.
But maybe I'm not familiar enough with the British monarchy.
And yes?
Well, I think there will be more episodes. I mean, there have been quite a lot of episodes of that saga, because it's a saga. And it's also, I mean, ironically, it is cruel, but look at this young couple, fairly young couple. They, I mean, of course, living within the institution of the royal monarchy and the royal family must be hell. But they left that hell, so they must be happy. But for the last 2 years and a half, living in California and telling the whole world, life is fantastic, they feed on resentment.
They
why?
want a
Because
normal
it's
life.
business.
They want a normal
Well,
life, but
they
they go
want
on TV, they write a book, they do Oprah Winfrey.
Well, they've got a four book contract. Okay, so this is the first one. We've got another 3,
It's nuts,
so
isn't it?
probably there are more revelations and more, more things to come. And what is striking is that he says, Prince Harry, that he's hoping to reconcile. But how can you reconcile
Well, he
when you
probably
audition
bet on his
so
father's
much stuff?
forgiveness.
But what else is there to say?
There you go, Catherine.
Would you forgive him?
Well, I think probably if he would stop. Me personally, I just want the whole thing to stop.
Because it's all like woe is me, but at the same time, as you've just outlined about the member of your family who works in the NHS, there are people who are really struggling, and these people, they have money, they get they get money from the sovereign grant, they get money from the families and all the sort of the money they got from inheritance and stuff. It's all there for
But they're
them.
entertainment.
It's an entertainment
The
thing.
British, Americans have Hollywood. You guys have the royal family.
And Premier League football.
That I've heard of that. By the way, does Liverpool play football?
Liverpool have a team.
Okay. It's entertainment. The British Fleet Street, the press, they live off these people. It's just great entertainment. So
reality TV.
Sit back and enjoy this dysfunctional, inbred German royal family that somehow became to control Great Britain, UK, Northern Ireland.
Well, there's something called dignity, and there's some slight remnant in the UK. And
Dignity?
Yes, dignity. And so I think this is also what
You can buy dignity at Fortnum and Mason's. I mean.
Well, no, that's another kind of
But
dignity.
what I can't measure is, does Harry still enjoy certain sympathy in the UK at the moment?
Well,
Because
not much.
before
I
he
mean,
had that sympathy.
yes.
He was the most popular royal, wasn't he?
Possibly before
When they
before.
got married, he's the most
Yeah.
popular royal.
Yeah,
wasn't he?
that's before. No, but the thing, I think a lot of people feel
royal.
sorry for him. A lot of people feel sad for him because we're having a sort of therapy in public. And, you know, he should just go on saying his shrink rather than having the whole world witnessing
Watching
it.
Public, I don't think the public would allow him to do that. This is entertainment.
It's a vicious circle that
Exactly.
feeds into itself.
There you
So
go,
he
Catherine.
they
That's
complain
it.
they get badly treated by the press. They were. I
Bingo.
think, especially
Yeah.
Meghan was terribly treated by the British press and the establishment. So then they talk about it and then they get more headlines and then they get bitten into and then it's...
I'm not sure we can say that the public as a whole, as if there was such a thing, wants this.
They buy the newspapers, they buy the books, they watch the Netflix.
Well, not every one of them.
it's like the NFL.
Do you?
American
You're a
football.
British citizen. Do you?
I wouldn't watch it. I
But
wouldn't
it's
watch it.
distraction from everything that's
There
going
you
on that
go.
we've been talking about in the UK as well. This is
It's
some
why
kind of
people watch soap
reality
operas, isn't it?
TV.
And this is a soap
Yeah.
opera. It's a whole thing. Yeah.
I bought 2 British tabloid newspapers today. I admit. Aha! I admit.
Evidence.
So it's yeah.
Richard, you proved the point.
And one of them, the Daily Mirror, had that headline, "It's all over now," with the photo of the 2 boys when they were at schools.
Yeah.
So
Well, probably
Maybe
it
it's all
is,
over.
Yeah.
Let's quickly turn to our final topic, COVID and China. Once again, in the same headlines this week, images of hospitals in Shanghai sending shockwaves across the world, reminding people where the pandemic started, of course. It's actually happening again. There's been a relaxation of the zero COVID policy, which was incredibly controversial. There was protest against that, of course, late last year. But now the situation shows that, especially here in France, for instance, travellers coming in from China, they'll be subject to testing or at least checking to see whether they're COVID positive or not. We've reported tonight about how South Korea is coping with Chinese travellers coming in who are COVID positive. And the Chinese New Year is approaching, Year of the Rabbit, which is auspicious apparently, but of course it also could be a sign of COVID spreading. Let's hear from China's transport minister with the advice from Beijing.
我们还是倡导大家根据自身
We encourage people to make travel plans based on the situation of themselves and family members. In particular, the elderly with underlying diseases and the families with pregnant women, infants and children should try to reduce travel as much as possible to avoid the infectious risk during travel.
减少出行，以降低自身和家庭成员的
Okay, the COVID situation. Are you convinced?
Well, I believe, first of all, that we talked about Vladimir Putin appearing quite weak at the moment in Russia, and I think Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is in difficulty because he doesn't have a policy. The reality is that the Chinese government at the moment doesn't have a policy to contain that COVID pandemic, that new wave of COVID pandemic. Their vaccine apparently doesn't work, and they have no other solution than letting people go and telling them to stay at home. So they are heading to voluntary confinement, and before the Chinese New Year, there are a lot of doubt that it will work, especially after 2 years of strict lockdown. So I believe it's a political problem for China, and when it comes to European countries or even Asian countries around China, to me, asking test at the entrance, at the border, is quite logical and normal. I mean, let be reminded that before, to enter China, you needed a quarantine of 2 or 3 weeks. So asking Chinese visitor a test, to me, sound quite normal.
And yes, people behave in Europe like there's no risk anymore.
Well, I mean, the key word is vaccination. And Xi Jinping should, could really put himself out of that political misery by just, admit that the Chinese vaccine is not efficient, not as efficient as it should be. And actually, the European Union offered millions of vaccines to the Chinese government. So that's the only way to resolve the problem. We could also, in Europe, we're asking for tests. we should ask for a proof of an efficient
True.
vaccine, because a lot of the Chinese bourgeoisie goes and travel to some places where they can get the Pfizer.
A ban on visitors having only the Chinese vaccine would be, to me, legitimate.
Well, there's only one real question I have, and perhaps any of our people who are watching us in China over VPN can answer it. You know, did President Xi and his cronies, did they get the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine?
Or the Chinese vaccine.
I'm damn sure they didn't get the Sinovacs.
The Russian vaccine.
I'm sure they didn't get that either. I know the Sinovacs that was sent to Turkey and they gave to people at hospitals there, they were bringing in Moderna and Pfizer privately to give their people. So I'd like to know what vaccine old President Xi has, because, I'm sure he's either got Moderna or Pfizer. And I think that's a legitimate question that should be asked at the next Foreign Ministry press conference.
Catherine, I can't ask you about that, but what I can ask you is about what France is doing, testing as Chinese people arrive. Is it a fair thing to do?
Well, we've had years of testing, years of travel restrictions. If there's a massive outbreak in China, which, by the way, we don't know how many cases there actually are because there's no reliable data. I think it's perfectly reasonable to require tests from a country where there's concerns about this is just going to get worse, obviously, before it gets better. It is the Lunar New Year coming up, and millions of migrant workers are going to be travelling back to rural areas on packed trains and buses. This is going to be spreading to huge extents, which we don't even know about now. China, this is its first national outbreak, and I think it's just really huge.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Catherine Ross-Trent, our senior correspondent. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to Agnès Poirier, correspondent for L'Express in London. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Richard Verley from Blick website, France Europe correspondent. Great to see you, sir. And thanks as ever to Craig Capitas of the Daily Beast. Great to see you, sir. Thanks to you.
You will walk alone, sir.
Let's end on a football note. Pelé was laid to rest this week. The king of world football passed away on December the 29th. It was my dad's birthday, actually. He'd been in palliative care for cancer. His family say it was COVID that actually claimed his life. And what a life it was. From childhood poverty to the world soccer heights. He signed for Santos FC age 15, went straight into the first team. At 17, he won the first of 3 World Cups for Brazil, the only player to ever achieve that. Pelé transcended the beautiful game, as he called it. His name and legend will live on worldwide. Pelé, then known simply in Brazil as the King, will leave you with these images of people mourning his loss and celebrating his legend. Thanks for watching The World This Week.
Você vai ver tudo bem pra você. Hoje é o dia do amor.